Greetings, sword friends. Finally, somebody has implemented a rapier in the right way. And newsflash, it actually cuts. Actually, it cuts quite well. In some cases, comparable to a Renaissance two-handed greatsword in the extensive test cutting I have done on ballistic gel side analogs. This is the Saxony military rapier, one of the newer rapier models by historical sword recreationist LK Chen. In fact, in the year 2022, he offered a few different models of rapiers. The first one is this Saxony rapier, which is a very atypical sword, and we're going to discuss what a rapier actually is in this review. But he also offered a stereotypical Spanish cup-hilt rapier and an Italian 7-ring rapier, which is quite iconic to the period. Now, the headline of this sword is that it cuts exceedingly well, despite the connotation carried by being called a rapier. When you talk about a rapier, usually the image coming to average person's mind is a very narrow blade sword with complex hilt of Renaissance origin. Now, the word rapier is quite a loaded term. In its original language, Spanish, spada rapira just means dress sword. And it typically means a sword of a very long blade, and more often than not, a narrow blade, and a complex hilt with shell guards, ring guards, swept hilt for extra hand protection comparing to medieval swords. Now, most people think rapiers are thin-bladed swords. Couldn't be further away from the truth. Now, rapiers have narrow blades in this dimension, but they are thick. Now, you cannot see that just from looking at two-dimensional photos. And if you visit museums and see antique rapiers in their collections, if you don't pay attention and look at the side, you wouldn't notice that they are usually very thick, especially at the base, and it has a very pronounced distal tapering, meaning that the thickness gradually tapers down. But for most rapiers, due to their thrust-centric purpose, they remain relatively thick even at the foible, just below the tip, to remain rigid throughout. As you know, for thrusting, rigidity is of paramount importance, because when a blade flexes, especially on these long blades, they're always going to have some flex. If you make the rapier blade incorrectly and start too thin at the base and not carry enough distal taper, this is what happens. See, that's not too much force. I can bend this to become a C curl. Obviously, it will permanently bend the blade on this not very well-made windlass rapier. When it thrusts into a target, whenever it meets resistance, it will start flexing. And that will disperse the force instead of concentrating all that force into the target and jabbing with certain depths required to damage the opponent. And you will see this in the test thrusting against a ballistic gel side analog with this rapier. We can diagnose why that is, and it's a very common symptom for modern make rapiers. They don't want to do the work to start from a thicker stock. If you look at the base of these two swords, oh my gosh, you know what? This windlass rapier is about half the thickness of this LK Chen Saxony rapier, despite it being much narrower in the blade. Now, I will show you the detailed measurement of a good collection of 16th and 17th century rapiers. If we look at all the narrow-bladed rapiers that start out at the base, at a width between 20 and 25 millimeters, they all carry a thickness between 8 and 11 millimeters. Now, this windlass, and just like many other modern make rapiers, because they are usually made for SCA, so in that case, you're required to have a very flexible blade because you don't want to kill your sparring opponents accidentally. Having a certain degree of flex is required, and this habit of making very thin blade, right, incorrectly, is carried through the reproduction market. And many makers, when they make legit, real rapiers with blade bevel and proper tips, they don't worry about the proper thickness, resulting in very flexible blades and also very incorrect handling characteristics. You see, the profile taper, right, the narrowing of the width from the base to the tip, and the thinning of the thickness from the base to the tip, and other factors like the cross-section, fullers, dictates the mass distribution on the blade. And you can see the detailed analysis of these antique swords in the Gotti collection. They have a chart for the weight distribution along the blade. Profile taper and the distal taper, when implemented correctly, will have the desired benefit of making the blade rather nimble at the tip because it carries so much less mass than the bottom half of the blade. You can see it gradually reduces the mass across the blade's length. So when you use the blade, it rotates very rapidly, reach the terminal velocity very quickly, and that will also assist in stopping the blade. So you can have very precise tip control, right? Wherever you want to jab into, and this is crucially important in rapier fencing. You know, the point goes to exactly where you want it to go, and you have to do that while parrying the opponent's sword. So have a very nimble, speedy, and precise sword is of paramount importance if you want to win a duel or fight. Now, I can tell you that despite these two blades being almost equal in blade length, 39 inches, and that is about the average length for rapiers. Some rapiers are a little bit shorter, 36, 37 inches long blade from the crossguard to the tip. Others are exceedingly long, even reaching 50 inches. So you see the scientific mass distribution on the blade is really crucially important for you to still be able to control swords. And those very long rapiers are very heavy, approaching 4 pounds. So imagine that you hold the rapier out to a certain extent because you're not supposed to hold the rapiers like this, retract it, like when you use medieval swords, because they don't have complex hand protections. When you have this amount of protections with ring guards, with swept-hilt, you can extend your rapier out like this to maximize your reach. So holding the sword out away from your body with your arm extended for a prolonged period of time will really tire you out with the weight and the mass distribution is done incorrectly. And that is the case for this windlass rapier. When I first sheathed it and put in some different rapier guards, after 15 seconds, I was already exhausted because of the excessive weight and the incorrect mass distribution, despite the point of balance being somewhat close to the hilt. And not to mention to start swinging it or doing some thrusting motions. These swords have similar sizes, and this one weighs 3 pounds and 5 ounces, right? Extremely heavy, while this one weighs 2.7 pounds. And that comes from the shell guard for extra hand protection on this one, but it's also done wrong because it carried a wrong thickness. But you will just have to wonder that with such an incorrect blade, with a very thin thickness at the base, how come it's so heavy and unwieldy? Well, one of the reasons is that at the tip, the blade carries roughly more or less equal amount of mass comparing to the base. Whereas on this LK Chen rapier, at the tip, it carries less than 1/6, right? 15% of the weight as the base. So that makes it very nimble and very quick and really easy to use altogether. I held this rapier in my hand while loading the cutting targets during the test cutting session, and after half an hour, I was not fatigued at all. And that is very rare because I have used many two-handed swords, one-handed swords. Usually, if you keep holding them, they will fatigue you to a certain degree. Not the case with this rapier. This is actually a rather broad-bladed rapier, comparing to many of the stereotypical thrust-oriented rapiers. These start out very narrow at the base, and it still tapers out, right? Narrows furthermore as it goes near the tip. Whereas this LK Chen rapier starts out at 36 millimeters at the base. So you can just say it's almost at a medieval arming sword width. Now, if you look at many of the poke shot type 18 blades on 15th century arming swords, they are not excessively wide, but they're rather broad because even with a degree of profile taper, they want to maintain some width. So these type 18 blades are balanced between cut and thrust. They can cut rather well, but they are also good thrusters against gambeson or even mail armor. In the second half of the 15th century, many type 18 blades became longer and narrower. Some of the arming swords you see at museums basically have this profile. It's cross-section profile, which is a diamond cross-section on this LK Chen Saxony rapier of German origin. Saxony is a region in the Holy Roman Empire that sits in modern-day Germany and Netherlands. Now you can see this is my Albion Kingmaker, a mid-15th century arming sword with a typical type 18 blade. And you can see this rapier here. Obviously, it's a natural evolution of this type of blade in the 16th and 17th century. And even though you can see there's a significant difference in the width of the blade, it has similar degree of tapering in the profile and similar degrees of distal tapering in the thickness. Obviously, this shows a degree of natural evolution in the sword design. You can see that obviously the type 18 blade in the 15th century signifies its purpose of balancing between cut and thrust. And it's just an average mid-length blade of reasonable broadness at the base of the blade and has a gentle taper, even though it tapers into a very acute point for armor penetration. It still has some broadness at the point of percussion, the ideal cutting portion of the blade. So this is very similar to this Saxony rapier. Indeed, the philosophy is to maintain certain widths on the upper portion of the blade, and you can feel them. They almost move almost in the same way, just very point nimble, precise, but still carries some authority, unlike the type 15 blades, which tapers much more in the profile, so they are narrower, but they need to remain a little bit thicker, kind of like the medieval equivalents of later rapiers to focus more in the thrust. So I'll ask you that whether it's a surprise at all that this Renaissance cut and thrust military rapier or long-bladed side sword cuts exceedingly well, almost like a two-handed sword. Not really, and lots of the traits have already been introduced in the 15th century, right? Like the diamond cross-section with the hollow ground geometry, the mass distribution, the tip geometry. This is just carry on that tradition in subsequent centuries, the evolution of arms and armor. And you can see that with this diamond cross-section and a certain degree of hollow ground geometry, it reduces a lot of the weight on the blade, but at the base, it's rather beefy. We have this ricasso of a rectangular cross-section, which is twice the mass of a diamond cross-section of the same thickness and width. And then just above the ring guard, it transitions into this full diamond cross-section, and there's no elongated ricasso at the base. Unlike later period rapiers, it transitions into this cutting edge immediately, and it remains so for the remaining length, pretty much the entire length of the blade. It has a noticeable amount of profile taper, so near the base is about half the width as the base. It has a very refined edge geometry, given that hollow ground geometry on the diamond cross-section, there's almost no Appleseed geometry I can detect. So this contributes to the good weight of the overall blade. It's 2.7 pounds For a blade of this size, I would say average, but if you consider the width of the blade, which is rather wide for rapier, it's rather reasonable, I should say. And indeed, maintaining certain width on the upper portion, the ideal cutting portion near the point of percussion of this blade, assists the blade bevel to have a smaller edge angle, so it passes through the target with even less effort. Now, you also have to consider rapiers having long blades can have very significant tip speed. And I'm not sure whether you can hear the sword wind by this rapier. It's a very loud sword. It's even louder than many of my long swords with hollow ground geometry. When you do these big swings with wind up, man, it just roars, slides through the air with speed. And that translates into good cutting performance. There's a bit of a buzz recently on the internet. I have already been told that rapiers can cut, especially this particular model. If you watch Scholar Gladiatoria, Matt Easton's videos.
Now, I have absolutely no doubt at all that this will cut really well. First of all, because it's really sharp, but secondly, because the blade on it, frankly, is pretty much like some medieval arming swords. It's a hell of a blade on it.
And Scholagrim confirms that this rapier cuts even better than many military sabers, and those are cut-centric swords.
That's better. It could just be me because I'm sick, so not a good day. Crank up the difficulty. What could go wrong?
And my friend Vic and John at She Sword Review
probably means it's a better backyard cutter, right? It'll be a little bit more forgiving in cuts like that. And you're right, the cracking a whip analogy was actually really well done, because yeah, you do this and bam, and you don't feel anything, and it's freaking crazy. But yeah, it handles really, really well.
So I already expect it to perform well, bucking the stereotype of a rapier that cannot cut very well. Now, you have to face it. If you sharpen a rapier, even like this, you sharpen it well, even with a relatively obtuse edge angle, such long blade can generate a lot of tip speed. When it meets unprotected areas, right, just naked flesh, yeah, it will cause a very gnarly wound. It just whip across someone's face or neck. It can be fatal, or it can cause a lot of blood to incapacitate the opponent. Well, you can't really fight when you're bleeding all over your face. Now, many rapier sword experts told us that rapiers indeed can cut, even the thrust-centric types, but still, the cutting performance, especially on the ballistic gelatin human thigh analog, really shocked me. And you see the title, this sword cuts potentially better than two-handed greatsword. How could I say that, to be sure? Well, empirical evidence. I have done some extensive test cutting on the same 15% ballistic gel human thigh analog with a wooden dowel in the center. Now, ballistic gels are a little bit denser. Well, at least my formula is. Regular pork flesh is 1.08 to 1.1 in density, and my ballistic gel is 1.15, so that's denser. Also, you know that once it congeals, it's all solid matter, even though it's soft. And when you cut through it, there's no liquid. Unlike flesh, you have water, you have probably blood, bodily fluid, and that will make the cut easier. Also, the flesh parts when it gets cut, much more so than ballistic gel. So a ballistic gel of the same mass and circumference as a human thigh will be quite a bit tougher to cut than an adult human thigh. Obviously, the ballistic gel doesn't offer the tear resistance of skin, and that is taken care of water jug, water bottles, outer shell. That is thin but tough. And obviously the bone is a lot harder than the flesh. That's providing the structural integrity, the strength and resilience of our bodies. However, living bones are more flexible. They are much easier to cut. Now, you know that a lateral impact on your thigh or on your arm within the reasonable amount of force will not cause them to bend and break, because they can flex to a certain degree. So this way, it's rather resilient. Now, it is harder, but not as hard as a dry and hardened wood. And this wooden dowel of 1/2 inch thickness indeed provides that rigidity. In my previous test, it's rather hard to cut unless you have a very proficient cutting blade. Now, I have to tell you that to cut these wooden dowel into smaller pieces to fit into these SCA analog jugs, I have to cut them with a hatchet. And one blow from the hatchet would not sever them in two, even on a chopping board. So they are not easy to cut at all. And indeed, the Albion Maximilian, late 15th century Germanic two-handed sword with a very wide cutting blade, very proficient at cutting, a renowned cutter of that size. I use it to cut through a jug a little bit thicker, about 25% more in cross-sectional area. I cut through about 80%. Indeed, it cut through the bone, but when I inspect the incision of the cut on the wooden dowel, bone analog, I can see that it's not a very clean cut. There's some crushing damage, meaning that the blade didn't go through very smoothly. However, when I use this Saxony rapier to cut the same ballistic gel SCA analog, it sliced through bones like it was nothing there. And I inspect the incision afterwards on the wooden dowel. It's a really smooth surface. There's no jaggedness, no tearing, no crushing at all. It just passed through. Now, my first cut on the SCA analog is a little bit sloppy. It cuts closer to the neck, so the cut is very vertical. It didn't go all the way through. However, the bone was cut through very smoothly.
You would think that cut failed, but look at this. Cut through the bone, cut all the way in. Look at how deep it went. Wow, it actually did it. Look at this. 18 inch of circumference. Ballistic gel SCA analog with bone. And here's the top half of the bone cutting cleanly through. Second cut completely, right? Bypassed the first cut all the way through. So in theory, this rapier could cut through an adult's thigh. It's one mighty blow. Look at this. Unbelievable, isn't it? It's a single-handed sword. Thrust-oriented sword. Very narrow blade. But look at this. And look at the first cut. Went all the way, cutting through the bone, all the way down here. Once again, cuts through this trunk, cuts through the bone cleanly over here. So it went through that much gel. And look at the cross section over here, completely smooth. There's no scooping, no jagged edges, going through the bottle. You can see this is a bone on this end being cut. We push the bone out here. This analog is hardwood, dry and hardened, and look at the surface. Wow, it's so smooth. It's like it's being cut by a table saw, and polished.
Subsequent cuts prove that this rapier, when executing cuts with big windup, can cut the bone very smoothly, the wooden dowel, I should say, much more so than the Albion Maximilian. This tells me that it met so much less resistance, and indeed, it cuts through the gel without problem. Now, indeed, this jug is thinner than the first SCA analog I used with the Albion Maximilian cutting test. However, the Maximilian didn't go all the way through. It cuts through the upper part, which is about 25% thinner. So I would say that this rapier has at least the cutting capacity. I'm not talking about overall impact, just the cutting performance against organic materials, right? Soft materials, dense gel, tougher than muscle, and the shell, the bottle shell, and the wooden dowel, it cuts definitely cleaner and easier than the Renaissance two-handed sword. You have to ask why, other than the scientific mass distribution to allow you to accelerate the blade very effectively, but also having a long blade to carry significant tip speed. But that is the same case for the LB Maximilian. It has even a longer blade than this rapier. It's the edge geometry and sharpness. Now, this rapier blade, when you touch it, it doesn't feel like a razor, even though the edge geometry is extremely fine, pretty akin to my Zodian razor. However, the apex is refined, but it's not really that thin. I accidentally brush my finger across this blade and get lightly chopped a few times. It didn't break any skin, and I know that with other swords of very good sharpness, I could easily just cut through my skin, not very deep, just accidental brushing. So it's good in the sharpness, but it's not really that razor edge and being fragile. I would speculate that primarily it was caused by the good edge geometry, which is hollow ground geometry, not a lot of material backing the edge behind it. Now, is this gonna make it vulnerable, more fragile? At least not to any tough and hard organic material. And I make it a little bit less durable against other rapiers when you parry, but not against like wood or bone. And after cutting through the wooden dowel time and again, it didn't lose any of the edge sharpness. I can run my fingernail across the edge. It still has that refined edge, very smooth. There's no any dulling or rolling or glinting, even on the microscopic level. And that is truly shocking. But it's also a testament of the importance of edge sharpness and good edge geometry, because it passed through the target with minimal resistance. So the edge and the entire blade pass through very quickly. There's no turning, getting stuck in the target, in the wood. It wouldn't cause edge deformation.
And I do a rapier snap cut, proper small motion cut. Here's this is a cut. It's a snap, quick cut over here. You can see the depths. Not the cleanest cut, but really damaging still. See the incision here. Oh, it's quite deep. About 3 inches deep. I would say 4 inches wide. Just a snap, bang, and downward flash, and retrieve the blade. So if this is a shoulder, well, you're not gonna move anymore, suffice to say. I could see through the setting sun that the gel parted momentarily, and then it came back up together. But look at this incision. Again, snap cut. Wow. Terrifying. Okay. Can you see how much it went in? Can you see it from here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, whoa, that's gonna hurt. Look at this. I'll say 4 inches penetration into a very dense gel. So if this goes into a thigh, this is how much it goes in. Terrifying, isn't it? Let's do it again. Okay, let's saw this time. About 2.5 inches. Remember, this is not held down by a person's whole body weight. Right, plus the skeletal structure behind it. Just 7 pounds of ballistic gel over here. actually push the gel forward, so meaning that you kind of reach the maximum penetration. Again, about 3.5 inches. So that's about the penetration between 2.5 and 4 inches. Yeah, could be much deeper into a person's torso or side, but to, let's say, an upper arm, that's about the extent of the penetration on this rapier. Kind of a cut and thrust rapier rather than a thrust-centric one, with this broad blade, comparatively speaking.
Now let's take a look at how the incorrectly made windlass rapier performs in thrusting tests.
Look at penetration. Not too bad, 2.5 inches. Let's do it again.
You can see, in contrast to the LK Chen Saxony rapier, the excessive flex in the windlass rapier makes it less predictable and reliable in thrusting. If you land square on, it will go in just as deep, as the blade near the tip is quite narrow.
Pretty deep. This is a narrower rapier, mind you. So, I'll say 4 to 4.5 inches. So, did pretty well. Although it could have gone further, but the flex of the blade really stopped it. This is not much force at all. I can do this all day. You can see this blade is incorrectly thin at the base, so overall it's just a very flexible blade. See how much the blade flexes?
If the point alignment isn't perfect, the entire blade will flex around quite excessively and dissipate the force, which pushes the target forward like a punch instead of going all the way in as intended. The point is also less accurate as the Saxony rapier that carries the correct mass distribution.
wasn't much effort at all, especially the last cut. See how clean the cut went? Each cut. Cut through the thickest part of the plastic neck. Fluted. Got zero glinting. Zero glinting. Sharpness is exactly as before. It's extremely well heat treated.
And I should say that this blade, for its length, is properly rigid. It has a lot of profile taper and even more distal taper. At the base, it's at 7.6 millimeters thick. And it tapers down to 2.2 millimeters at 2 inches from the tip. So that's just 70% of distal taper. It lost 70% of the thickness from the base to the tip. This causes the blade to be very nimble, but also near the cutting portion is properly thin to have very small edge angles. It also causes the blade to be rigid in the bottom 2/3. Now you can see I flex the blade. It can flex because of the thinness here, but it only flexes in the last third of the blade, right? Comparing that to the windlass rapier, it flexes throughout and to a much larger degree. This one remains very rigid. So when you thrust into a target, when the angle is not completely at 90 degrees with the surface of the target, it will flex a little bit, but not nearly as much as an improperly made rapier, right? Flexing will dissipate the force of the thrust, and you will see the target get pushed aside, and it bounces off the stand, and you can see the penetration isn't great at all. It's probably just 1 to 2 inches by the windlass rapier. On this sword, it can go in very deeply, 5 to 6 inches when you thrust with a good tip alignment, and it will go in very deep and not flex as much. But even though the alignment is bad, that happens in fighting sometimes. The edge alignment or the tip alignment isn't always optimal, and you just have to make do and still cause some damage, hopefully. You see that this Saxony rapier went in and the blade flexed a little bit, but still it did its job. So if you fight against a human opponent, a human is backed up by the skeletal structure, it will go in much deeper than a 10-pound heavy jug filled with ballistic gelatin. So I would say that this rapier, despite being very atypical in the blade, very broad and cut very well, it can still perform just like a thrust-centric rapier. You might call this a Renaissance military sword or cut and thrust sword. It can perform cut and thrust equally well. But if you compare the sword to many of the side swords that have a blade that's broader but doesn't taper as much in the profile, they taper in the same degree as the thickness, such as the LK Chen Rebuttal I reviewed last year, kind of like a late medieval arming sword, early Renaissance, early side sword, has a quite long blade, but very thin. At the base, it's still much thicker than the foible because of the distal tapering, but comparing to this rapier, indeed, it's much thinner. And if you look at many of the antique 16th century side swords with very broad profile comparing to these rapiers, Yeah, because of the cost-centric mentality, at the base, they can be thinner at 5 to 6 millimeters. Now, if you look at many windlass rapiers, right, they are less than 5 millimeters at the base in terms of thickness. And there's almost no distal tapering. Suffice to say, such kind of mass distribution and its resulting handling characteristics are a far cry from some of the antique narrow-bladed rapiers. You see that originals typically have close to twice the thickness and a much greater degree of distal tapering than these incorrectly made modern rapiers. And I'm not trying to be unfair to Windlass here. It's not just them. Many of other SCA-rated rapier makers are doing the exact same thing, which makes their rapiers not handle like real ones at all. Now, many of them have already caught on. Take Windlass, for example. They're actively working with Matt Easton, who examined many of the originals at Royal Armories in Leeds to develop new models. I have full confidence that their next batch of Royal Armories collection offerings will have the correct thickness and distal tapering, among other aspects. Incidentally, HEMA supply maker Keviton Armory, who also works with Matt Easton, has come up with 2 new rapier models that starts out thicker than 8 millimeters at the base. Fortunately, we don't have to wait for these prototypes to become new models. LK Chen is already out there making proper rapiers. Now, if we just look at the hilt, it's a typical late 16th century, early 17th century Germanic style swept-hilt rapier's hilt. You can see it has 3 side rings on the outside of your hand, and there's a swept hilt on the inside to join with this knuckle bow here. But it also has a typical crossguard. So this offers good amount of hand protection against cuts. This tells us the rapier's usage in this period involves still a lot of cuts because this hilt doesn't add a lot of extra weight because of these perforations. Well, I wouldn't say perforation, just opening. However, it doesn't really prevent lots of thrust against your hand, so you still have to use a lot of lateral movements to effectively use these scars to guard against thrust, the tip. Also, this protruding critons protect your forearm to a certain extent. If you look at the pommel, you see it's a typical squash geometry. There's some side protrusion. This tells us that it doesn't want you to grip the sword entirely with your hand on the grip. It wants you to loop your finger across the crossguard, and that fingering on the side will offer the protection like this with 2 fingers above the crossguard, and that's also possible. Now the entire hilt is very ergonomic despite all these side bars, these extra geometries, thanks to the very ergonomic grip with steel wire wrap. It's stainless steel, so it will not suffer any corrosion when you grip onto the steel wire wrap. It doesn't require excessive maintenance. And you can see the risen geometry popular in the Germanic regions in the Renaissance is really well executed. There are additional steel wires in the grooves of the risen geometry. On the top and bottom of the grip, you have the Turk head style twisted wire wrap, and it's quite well done comparing to this Windlass rapier. You can see it's really done haphazardly, both the steel wire wrap on the grip and the Turk's head style twisted wire. This one is really well executed, and you can see has a nice oval cross section for you to index the edge alignment, which is what contributes to the overall nice cutting performance. I will say that loop your finger across the guard is very comfortable until you do these big guard and repose or just big cut with wind up. It starts to create some hot spot due to these geometries at the transition between the central part and the side critons. There's an impact, your index finger will suffer. And I wore thin glove on my main hand to mitigate this. Still, after cutting up dozens of targets, my finger has some blistering and felt sore for about a day. Not excessive, Obviously, you can wear thicker gloves, and that will further mitigate the hot spots. However, you have less connection with the sword, so there's just a trade-off. Obviously, these geometries are found on many antique 16th century, 17th century rapiers, so that's just something you have to deal with. And there's no sharp ledges, sharp corners at the transition. Everything's well rounded off. I should talk about the only one drawback of this sword. It's really only not completely 100% positive because of this. That is the finish on the complex hilt. It carries the perfectly reasonable dimensions and shaping. If you look at it, it has grooves that cut into the central part of the crossguard. On the side of the crossguard, it has these decorative transitions from square cross-section to oval cross-section, has tapering, has a correct thickness, so it will not add too much weight like this improperly made windlass rapier. And the finish has this sandblasted appearance, which if you inspect close up, it really throws you off. Also, you can clearly see it's not made from welding several bars together. It's a cast piece, which is alright. If you cast original pieces, the hilt components, it will make them more accurate, and it requires less work, reduce the overall cost of the sword, but have the correct polish, the correct finish. This sandblasted appearance is just a far cry from many of the originals' polished and darkened look. So I would just recommend that LK Chen do away with this sandblasted finish and polish up a little bit further, clean off these. You can see there's some sign of casting that's left on the hilt, which really shouldn't happen. It doesn't affect the handling. Well, if your hand brush against it, it can hurt you, but these bars are really far away from your fingers, so it's very unlikely it will happen. Still, visually, it's just jarring. There are several spots on that hilt, some pitting as well. So I just recommend LK Chen to have the craftsman to polish up this swept hilt. It doesn't matter whether you use welding, forging, or you use casting. Right? Just polish up and use mild steel to avoid the dull gray look of the modern stainless steel, but have a black and antique look, coating on it. It will prevent corrosion. Same can be said about the pommel, but the pommel is of a more regular shaping, so it's easier to polish up. And indeed, the first owner of this sword, Brother Nathaniel, did some extra polishing on the pommel. Now it looks significantly better. So I would just recommend that. If you look at many of the high-end rapier reproductions, they do this very well. And I think it's totally possible for LK Chen to implement, because currently the finish of this rapier hilt is not worthy of the entire high quality of the sword. Everything is so well researched, well put together, it performs well, it handles just like antique rapiers, right? It's weighted correctly, has the correct mass, but it's well distributed. Everything is just nigh perfect, except for just a finish on that hilt, so it's almost there. Despite this small flaw, I will definitively say this Saxony rapier is my top recommendation of the year 2023. I will also talk about the quality of the blade. Other than the design and excellent edge geometry, hollow ground, mass distribution, distal taper, all that is of a really durable, high carbon, high manganese silicon tool steel, has a proper spring temper, extremely durable. Edge retention is just excellent. Cutting through wooden dowel again and again cleanly, but there's no edge dulling at all whatsoever. The tip I jam into not just targets, accidentally brush on the ground, jab into the ceiling, concrete walls. There's no dulling. This blade still retains its sharpness. The tip has its perfect pointiness throughout. There's no dulling, no rolling, and I have full confidence of this tool steel's toughness based on everything I've seen on destructive reviews, tests done on LK Chen's sword made of the same steel. And you can see the grind quality is extremely high. Central ridge is arrow straight, and both sides are very symmetrical indeed. There are some minor ripplings detected on the blade, and that is just unavoidable on a blade this flat, but also with some hologram geometry. This level of rippling is also found on my Albion Regent, which has a very similar cross section. Also on my Albion Kingmaker. Both have this type 18 long hologram blade with diamond cross section. And on top of that, you have a properly made wooden core scabbard. You just look at that, it's completely rigid, and it also has a cutout at the ricasso to go above the side rings and swept hilt to protect the base, the ricasso of the blade, because those are made of high carbon spring steel, so it's prone to rust. This way, as long as you keep it oiled, there's no worry at all. It's pretty simple, has a black leather wrapping with good leather stitching on the seam on the back. It has a simple shape. It's a little bit of protrusion on the tip. It looks perfectly good. It's also very lightweight, not bulky at all. It's easier to carry. Just unlike those floppy sheaths, leather sheaths on windlass rapiers. This rapier caused me a lot of grievance. On the inside of the mouth scabbard, they put in some hide, raw hide, or some pieces, and caused a lot of corrosion to the base of the blade. It takes really long time to clean off, which is never going to happen on this properly made wood core scabbard. And it fits really well. Even has a cutout to fit this central ridge on the cross guard. So it's just perfect. For high $100, and you will be lucky to have even a basic scabbard that's properly made. I'll tell you that you want to commission just like a bare bone scabbard from anyone in the US, it will just cost you $500 at least, just for a scabbard alone, not a sword. So the whole package is of excellent value that I cannot stress enough. I would like to also acquire the Spanish cup-hilt rapier and the Italian 7-ring iconic rapier. Wow, the look, just like rib cage on the side of your hand, ample protection. But you have to realize that it adds so much more weight to the hilt. It's probably not a big issue for a thrust-centric sword, and I have full confidence that LK Chen will implement those thrust-centric rapier blades correctly and have the right weight and geometry for the hilt components. Just make sure to have a higher polish. And this is what I like about LK Chen as a maker. He listens to feedback. And if you look at his many earlier offerings, he indeed take customer feedback and improve upon them. He also has a level of transparency for his process. You can see him designing these hilt components, incorporating the measurement from his liaisons abroad, a Metropolitan Museum and such, on the antique originals, but also the making process, the crafting of hilt components, fitting on the blade. And also, recently he announced that he has expanded his own in-house operation and got rid of his contractors altogether. Even though his contractors are capable, their quality and just the overall fit and finish is a little bit inconsistent with his in-house production. So I have the full confidence of LK Chen's judgment, and in the future, I'm pretty sure that these new models, including this Saxony Rapier, will be improved. Now, there's not much to improve upon. Everything is nigh perfect other than the swept-hilt finish. In the year 2023, he further expanded his operations, designs. He offers more models, Persian shamsirs, Mongolian sabers, and these are just swords that are not implemented correctly on the reproduction market. You probably need to spend 10 times as much to find a custom maker. And even so, maybe you'll get good fit and finish and really stunning visual elements, well polished on the hilt components, individually crafted, but sometimes you just don't get the correct handling. And that's truly sad. Now LK Chen is rectifying that with very affordable offerings, just handle extremely close to originals. And you say, well, $400 to $500 price range is not in the entry level. Yeah, it shouldn't be. It's a very advanced offering with a lot of research, trial and error, prototyping. So I would say that his pricing is more than reasonable, adequate. Now, if you want to order this exact model, you can visit LK Chen's own website, and it's priced at $500. $500, not at $5,000, not at $1,000. Even at $1,000, I will be perfectly happy with a sword this precisely reproduce the original, that cut and thrusts this well, handles this well. So do yourself a favor and visit his own website to check out this and other offerings. But Call of the Cena also carries a number of LK Chen's models, and they regularly update their new offerings. Although they sell at a slightly increased rate, their shipping cost to, especially in North America, is much less than LK Chen's own shipping costs from Asia. So check it out. 100% recommendation from me. It's only like a skin away from 10 out of 10. Now, if you enjoy this review, find any consumer guidance or just entertainment value, or acquire some knowledge about rapiers and Renaissance swords in general, please like and subscribe.